Look okay?
Yep.
All right. All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about two projects that are the main research focuses of my lab. Generally, what my lab's interested in is understanding how protein homeostasis is maintained in neurodegenerative diseases, or basically how cells can manage to prevent protein aggregation. So the first project that my lab focuses on actually uses an amoeba, the social amoeba called Dictyostelium discoideum. So here you can see a picture of the amoeba under the microscope. So it's a single cellular organism. It's actually isolated right outside of Asheboro, North Carolina, and it's found all over the world. And this amoeba eats bacteria. However, when it becomes starved, it undergoes a unique developmental cycle where about 100,000 cells chemotax together based on a cyclic AMP gradient to stream together and eventually form these fruiting bodies. And so they form these fruiting bodies because when starved, they form spores. So it appears something called a sorus, where about 80% of the cells reside as spores. And you can imagine a grasshopper could come across it on the forest floor, get some spores on its leg, transfer it a few meters across, where it can germinate and then have bacteria to eat and resume a normal life cycle. So we're not interested in this developmental cycle. A lot of people study that and the chemotaxis of it. Where we became interested is because when they sequenced the genome, it was unlike any other genome ever sequenced, in the fact that it encodes roughly 10,000 proteins with homopolymeric amino acid tracks. So what that means is the same amino acid just repeated over and over again. And we became interested in this because my lab was interested at the time in the polyglutamine diseases, including Huntington's disease and spinocerebellar ataxias. And Dictyostelium has about 2,500 repeats of polyglutamine, some of them being quite long, well within the disease threshold for these polyglutamine diseases. So we decided to ask the question of, is Dictyostelium unique in that it's the first organism that may be naturally resistant to protein aggregation, the first eukaryotic organism? So we expressed mutant Huntington with 103 glutamine. So this is the first exon. It's a very heavily aggregation-prone protein that aggregates in every other tested model organism that's recognized by NCBI. And in Dictyostelium, unlike those organisms, it stayed completely soluble. So we became interested in how Dictyostelium does this and performed a genetic screen and found a Dictyostelium-specific gene that's only in Dictyostelium discoideum that, when knocked out, results in protein aggregation. So we identified how Dictyostelium was able to be resistant to protein aggregation. The next question was, does this have any benefit to other cell types? So we expressed it in a number of different cells and showed that actually expressing SRCP1 could make human cells resistant to protein aggregation. And we could even take patient-derived iPSC-derived neurons. So this is a juvenile Huntington's patient who had 107 glutamine repeats. And you can see that if you make neurons from their stem cells, that they have these short neurite outgrowth phenotypes, so they don't extend like they properly should. And if we overexpress this protein from Dictyostelium, you can see that it restores that phenotype back to wild type levels. So we're currently doing a number of studies to try to see if this is therapeutic in mouse models of Huntington's disease and in spinocerebellar ataxia type 3 to determine if it's able to potentially be developed into a therapeutic. The second short project I'll tell you about is looking at the newest form of spinocerebellar ataxia, SCA48. So this was just discovered about 3 years ago. It's a dominant mutation in the STUB1 gene. And so you can see the genetics here. So in red are mutations that cause SCA48. In black are mutations that cause a recessive form of disease called SCAR16. And so right about a year ago, I was contacted by a neurologist at UPenn who had a patient they had been seeing for about 10 years with ataxia. And they did whole genome sequencing and found that there was a mutation in the STUB1 gene. This was an uncharacterized mutation. There was no family lineage of ataxia. The mother had dementia. There was no clinical reports of anything wrong with the father. So they asked if we would be willing to take a look to determine if this was actually a causative form of SCA48, a new de novo mutation. And so we performed a number of biochemical assays and cellular assays to describe how this protein was actually defective in function. And now we've developed the first animal models of SCA48. So we've developed a mouse model in addition. This is a roundworm model, so C. elegans. So in green here is a neuron expressing GFP. So this is just in a wild type worm. You can see that it has a healthy cell body, and there's these nice projections that form this segmented pattern in the body wall of the animal. If we overexpress CHIP, which is the protein that's encoded by the STUB1 gene, you can see it looks very similar to the wild type protein. So nice segmentation, healthy looking cell body. However, if we express a SCA48 causing mutation or this de novo mutation that was identified, what you can see is we have a dysmorphic cell body, loss of segmentation in the body wall, and these bead-like structures, which represent degenerating neurons. So From this, we've been able to now identify the cellular pathways which are dysregulated in SCA48, and we're coming through now to see if we can develop ways to potentially treat this new form of SCA, which has been suggested to potentially be one of the more common forms. So with that, I'll just end with thanking the people in the lab that did the work. Stephanie Santiago was my first graduate student who set up the dictyostelium project, and Janie Scaglione and Anna Umano have been responsible for setting up the SCA48 work that's now moving quickly in the lab. So thanks for your attention.
And thank you, Matt. That's just amazing stuff. I remember the first time I talked to Matt, and he told me he was working on slime molds. And yeah, I said, "You mean the thing under the rock?" And he said proudly, yes. And look what it's achieved. It's quite amazing. All right, let's turn it over to Don Sanders to introduce today's Grand Round speaker.
Thanks, Rich. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Gordon Smith. Let me share my screen. Okay, you see in the screen?
Yep, there it is.
Gordon's going to talk about the crisis in U.S. drug pricing. Gordon is professor and chair of neurology at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. He's also the Kenneth and Diane Wright Distinguished Chair in Clinical and Translational Research. Gordon is a native of Richmond. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Virginia in archaeology. That's very interesting, Gordon. We'll talk about that next time we meet. He went to medical school at Mayo and then did internship and residency at the University of Michigan in neurology, and was a fellow in neuromuscular disease, a neuromuscular fellowship also at Michigan. And then he did the requisite training at Hopkins for a year in cutaneous innervation. He joined the faculty at the University of Utah in neurology in 1997, rose through the ranks to professor in 2012, and then in 2018 went to his current position at VCU. I've known Gordon in a number of venues, but I think most recently in relationship to his interest in drug pricing in the US. So I'm going to turn this over. I guess, Will, you'll turn this over now to Gordon.
Excellent. Dr. Smith, go for it.
All right, thanks for that really great introduction. Appreciate it. Let's see if I can get this to work. If so, it's a surefire indication the pandemic is ending. There we go. Fantastic. Can you see and hear me? Thumbs up. Fantastic. Well, thanks for the introduction. I really appreciate seeing your grand rounds. What a great format. And I hope that we can learn from this. And what a great research presentation. I have a new respect for slime mold. This is going to be something entirely different. This is, as Don said, a bit of an interest of mine. And it'll become apparent why through the talk. But we really do have a crisis in drug pricing in the United States. I think we all recognize it. For those of you who talk to your patients about it, you see it on a daily basis. And so really what I'd like to do is describe it to you, talk about some of the work we have done, including several of your faculty, and trying to address it, and how you too can be part of the solution to this problem. And it's a problem that disproportionately affects neurologists and the patients that we serve. So these are my disclosures. I'm going to talk a little bit about Alexion at least once. I don't think any others are relevant to this discussion, except I'm probably annoying several pharmaceutical companies every time I give this talk. And the talk really should begin with thought about value and quality of care in the United States. And so this graph shows on the x-axis per capita healthcare spending, and you'll see the United States is way out to the right. By far the most expensive healthcare in the world, yet the outcomes are not the best in the world. Along the curve, you see most affluent countries. fall along this curve, but we are well beneath it. And so we've got expensive care, but not high quality. This is life expectancy. There's similar curves for infant mortality and others. And there's some systemic reasons for that. We are a much more complicated country and system, but I think it's hard to argue that we've figured out how to deliver quality care, which I'll define later on. What's driving healthcare costs aren't directly you and me. And in fact, physician services have become less expensive a little bit over the last few years. It's really hospital care and drug prices. Now, these percentages are changed. This doesn't mean that prescription drugs are the most expensive part of the healthcare system. It's just that they're rising at a rate even higher than hospital care, which is really what's driving increased healthcare costs more than anything else. And at least for drugs, this is an inflation-proof business. So this figure, the orange line, is the inflation rate every year. And for each year, you see a column, which is the price or the inflation rate for brand name drugs, top 260. So for instance, you can see in the depth of the Great Recession, slight degree of deflation, prescription drug prices went up 8%. And even in the last couple of years where the rate of increase in drug prices is mitigated a little bit, it's still outpacing the rate of inflation. And so this leads to something that I think, are increasingly calling financial toxicity. This hit the cover of the New York Times on the right, and it's a term that comes from the cancer literature, and it's one that should be familiar to all of us. We're accustomed to the idea that when we prescribe a drug, it can have side effects or toxicities, and you will often choose drugs based on their potential toxicities or reduce their dose if the patient has an adverse effect of the drug. And it's important to recognize that the cost of the medicines, and for that matter, the care we provide, can be toxic to our patients. And there are lots of statistics about this, but just to put some on the slide here, 1 in 4 Americans have difficulty affording their medicines. 15% of poor Americans ration their medications. A third of Medicare beneficiaries take fewer doses than prescribed. And according to the CDC, 1 in 5 prescriptions are abandoned at the pharmacy, which is pretty striking when 1 in 5 of your patients aren't filling the prescription you give them. And this is an example of that from the cancer literature. And this is really focusing on novel oral anti-cancer therapies. And so the column to pay the closest attention to is the gray column, which is abandonment. And you can see that for low-cost drugs, these are prescriptions that cost $10 or less. But 10% of prescriptions are abandoned, which is actually pretty remarkable and I think tells us something else. But if we look over at the far right, you'll see that almost 50% of the most expensive drugs are abandoned. And these aren't drugs for neuropathic pain or symptom management. I mean, these are disease-modifying drugs and exciting drugs that could be life-saving for patients, and yet half of them don't fill the prescription. And so that's pretty striking. So why is this the case? Why are drugs so expensive? I like this artwork from the New York Times because I think emphasizes that it's our patients who really bear the brunt of it, but it's not just our patients, as you'll see, it's all of us. So the first answer is that this is not a normal free market economy. We all know that because we're the ones prescribing the medicines. The patients aren't selecting it. So this isn't like buying a washing machine or a microwave. We have a pharmacy benefit manager sitting here in the middle of it all, negotiating discounts on each side of the deal. And so it's a complicated system, and this infographic from the Wall Street Journal really doesn't do it justice. So let's see, suddenly I cannot advance my slides. Let's try that. There we go. So the bulk of the costs, though, don't map from PBMs. They really are drug costs. And so, and you can see here, these are 2016 dollars, but I don't think this is substantively changed. The large majority of cost is really attributable to drug manufacturers. In fact, providers cost a little more than pharmacy benefit managers. Not that I'm saying that there isn't opportunity to improve the transparency and perhaps reduce costs by addressing some of these other players in the system, but the bulk of it is really drug manufacturing. And the bulk of that is brand name drugs. So brand name drugs account for only 10% of the market, and the rest are obviously non-brand name generic drugs, but they account for 80% of the cost. And the reason for that is as soon as 2 generics enter the marketplace, the cost of the drug drops by over 50%. And a good example in many ways of what we're up against is pregabalin. So pregabalin was launched in 2019. Its price doubled in the next 6 years, rose another 30% in the next 2 years. So pretty impressive. The cost that year was $2.5 billion for Medicare. That's substantially more than Medicare spends on doctor visits for neurologists. The generics were approved in 2019, and the monthly cost dropped from $450 to $12, or to pill by pill, $7.50 to 20 cents a pill when the generic came out. And so, not surprisingly, drug companies have found ways of delaying entry into the marketplace of generics so that they can sustain their profit margin for brand name drugs. A common strategy are secondary patents, or so-called evergreening. And one of the things you'll notice is there are all kinds of interesting kind of colloquialisms in drug pricing and pharmaceutical economics. And so this is a nice one, evergreening, which means you create an extended release version and patent that, for instance. And I'll talk more about patents in a moment. There's also reverse payment settlements, which is the rather sterile way of saying pay for delay, which you're familiar with. This actually is something that's generally not allowed anymore from a regulatory perspective, but it still does happen, but in very complex ways that may be harder for us to see on the surface. And of course, what's leading the charge are specialty drugs and orphan drugs, which I'll define in a moment. And for those of you who take care of patients with multiple sclerosis, you've been on the front line of this. The figure on the left shows the cost of disease-modifying therapies from their introduction, oftentimes 20 years ago to now. And you can see dramatic increases. I actually remember as a resident beta-seron coming out, and never would have thought it would play out this way. To put a number to Copaxone, 1,000% increase in list price from 1996 to 2018. So very dramatic. On the right are other drugs that are non-specialty orphan drugs, and you can see generally they've stayed about the same or gone down. These are drugs for neuropathic pain. Venlafaxine is pregabalin is the exception, and you can see the skyrocketing costs that I alluded to earlier that, of course, has fallen with the release of generic versions of pregabalin. So what is a rare disease or an orphan disease? So I'll define it numerically in a moment, but I want to emphasize that rare diseases are actually common. It sounds like something Yogi Berra might have said, but it's true. And that's because while there's 7,000 rare diseases, 10% of us have one of them. So that means over 30 million Americans have a rare disease. It means that rare diseases as a group are more common than cancer, diabetes, or heart disease. And as I continue, you'll see why there's been so much therapeutic discovery, not only because these are tractable targets, it's often easier to track down exactly what the molecular mechanism is, but there's a lot of money to be had. An interesting fact that our child neurologists will appreciate immediately is that rare diseases disproportionately impact children, and particularly infants, and 35% of deaths in the first year of life are attributable to a rare disease. The drugs that are being approved for rare diseases are expensive. And so these are the mean cost of the top 100 products in orphan and non-orphan space. And so you can see in the light blue, the most recent data that I have, 2018, $150,000 per year for an orphan drug. You'll notice that the non-orphan drugs only cost $33,000 a year, which we used to think of as a very expensive drug, and now doesn't quite seem so expensive. So they're extraordinarily expensive. And of course, at the extreme, much, much more than this. This gives you a sense of the rate at which orphan designations are taking place in approvals. And so these are the designations in blue, and you can see that they've really skyrocketed, particularly in the last 10 years. And of course, now we're seeing an increasing number of orphan drug approvals as a consequence of this. And so this is a major therapeutic strategy at many pharmaceutical companies. And this shows us the same thing in somewhat of a different way. So these are approvals year by year. And you can see that over the last 3 years, for instance, about half of these are for orphan products and half are not. And so while orphan diseases may impact 10% of us, they account for about 50% of indications for new drugs. And so this puts some numbers in terms of cost to this. So the purple line is the complicated figure. This shows us the percentage of overall pharmaceutical costs that are attributable to orphan drugs. And you can see that is projected to approach 20% later in this decade. And then the blue, you can see in billions of dollars, the the cost of orphan drugs. And so that's soon to pass $200 billion. And of course, we're now probably this year passing $1 trillion in drug costs, which is remarkable. These are worldwide sales, obviously. So what is an orphan disease? Orphan disease, orphan drug was defined by the Orphan Drug Act, which was co-sponsored by Senators Waxman and Hatch in 1983. And the intent was to de-risk or incentivize development of drugs for rare diseases. And prior to this time, there had only been 10 drugs approved for this space. So it was definitely a need. For those of you who are 1980s TV aficionados, Jack Klugman, who you remember from many things, but also from Quincy, was an advocate for this, and in fact went to the Hill and had a couple of episodes of Quincy focused on rare disease drug development, including neurologic disease. I think one was about Tourette's. This act has done its job since that time, over 600 approvals, and obviously it's a major focus of drug development now. And the definition is as follows. So one, there has to be a scientific rationale for why a drug could work to treat a disease. So that's not all that special. That's true for any new drug. But the meat of it is that an orphan designation is given if there's evidence that there are fewer than 200,000 people in the United States who have the disease. There's also a mechanism that if the sales wouldn't cover the cost of development, a drug can be approved. And there are a few that are approved under this provision of the Act, but the vast majority are based on perceived rarity of the disease. Now, I'll point out, obviously, 200,000 is not a particularly rare disease, but that's the definition that we live with right now. And this is the provisions. There are tax credits for clinical trials, FDA approval fee, FDA is waived, review length is shortened, but the meat of it is the exclusivity period, keeping in mind that drug companies make their money when the drug is branded. So 7 years versus 3 to 5 years. And so this is where the real incentive sits for development of orphan drugs. Now, that all sounds fine, and it sounds like a great success, but there are a number of ways that the Orphan Drug Act is being misused. And this is obviously a picture of our good friend, Ted Burns, who's talked a lot about this and has been a key partner and leader in advocating for fairness in drug pricing and value-based drug pricing. And so these, I think of, I trimmed this down to 4. There's a couple of extras, so I apologize for the numerical error there. But one is to purchase the rights to an existing inexpensive unapproved drug, approve it under an orphan designation, and then just monetize the heck out of it. One can repurpose an existing inexpensive approved drug for a different indication. So-called Trojan applications, get orphan status for a rare disease, get an approval, and then go big with a common disease. This is actually really common. If you look at some of the most profitable drugs in America, things like rituximab, Humira, they come from Trojan applications. Or salami slicing. Take a common disease, slice it into rare molecular phenotypes, get an approval under the ODA, and then you can get sequential new ODA designations for each of these slices of salami. So you can really sustain your exclusivity in the marketplace in dramatic fashions. These shenanigans, maybe that's not a bad term, are particularly prevalent in rare disease space. It's easier to justify a high price. The public will accept it because of the concepts of fairness, which we'll talk about in a moment. And there's usually limited competition. So if you're developing a novel immunotherapy or molecular therapy for a rare disease, you're not the latest cholesterol medicine, for instance. So let's talk about the first one, and this is unequivocally bringing coals to Newcastle, because the therapeutic development in this space has been led by Dr. Sanders. But this is, of course, 3,4 dimenopyridine. I'm not a chemist, but it looks pretty simple to me. This is the base formulation on the left. On the right is the phosphate salt, or FIRDAPS would be the trade name for this. And the history of this is familiar to many of you, but just to provide the background, for up until recently, almost 30 years, a very small, interesting drug company in New Jersey called Jacobus Pharmaceuticals, was providing this very effective treatment for free via compassionate use IND in the United States. So most patients got it for free. You could get it at compounding pharmacies for several $1,000s in a year. In the UK, cost maybe $1,500, $1,600 in pound equivalents. In 2010, the drug company biomarin purchased the rights to the phosphate salt and obtained EMA approval. Didn't do any additional trials. They actually used Jacobus trial data. And after an approval, they priced it very aggressively. And the price in the UK, for instance, was $60,000. This created a firestorm in the EU. I seem to recall Scotland actually revoked the approval. At the time, I was caring for a large cohort of LEMS patients, and there was a lot of concern that was realized in 2012 when Catalyst, not really a drug company, but a company nonetheless, purchased the rights for FIRDAPSE and went off to do a clinical trial. So we ended up with competing clinical trials. Dr. Sanders led the trial using the base formulation. Both were positive, and both were submitted as new drug applications to the FDA. Catalyst got into the FDA a short period before Jacobus. And as you may know, if two manufacturers submit an application for the same drug, doesn't matter how much it costs, doesn't matter anything. It's whoever gets in the door first wins. And so Catalyst was in the door first. And as this was transpiring, there was a lot of concern. What's the cost going to be? Catalyst was clearly looking to make a profit off of this. And they tipped their hand in an interesting fashion at a Wall Street conference called the Jefferies Conference in 2015. And you'll see that this is one of their slides that they were telling investors that there were 3,000 Lambert-Eaton patients in the United States, and this represented a $300 to $900 million market opportunity. So when this happened, I remember saying, holy cow, they're going to charge between $100,000 to $300,000 a year for this drug. And even Ted Burns said, Gordon, you're crazy. They're never going to do anything like that. But nevertheless, this created enormous amounts of concerns about what would happen. This is a fascinating story, and I'm not going to even begin to scratch at it, but one interesting tidbit is that Catalyst's own investors actually filed suit against them for two reasons. One, they claim not to have been told that there was another company making Threefour dimenopyridine, and two, they realized that there probably aren't 3,000 patients in the United States with Lambert-Eaton. This was obviously settled out of court. We don't know what happened. I find it interesting that people are investing in drug companies that didn't do their basic homework. So I guess this is a cautionary tale for those of you who are investors. And as a final aside on this, we actually did some epidemiology using the VA database, which is actually a powerful way of doing this, has some limitations that are fairly obvious, but robust data. This was really led by Stacy Clardy, who's a autoimmune neurologist at the University of Utah. But the bottom line is, based on that epidemiology, there are probably no more than 1,500 adults in the US with Lambert-Eaton. Adults becomes an important caveat in a moment. And so I think that 3,000 was an exaggeration, which is a very common theme in this space, where drug companies will try and boost up the numbers of patients in order to get investors interested. So this concern led to action. And so a group of us, led by Ted and me, put together this editorial. You'll see several Duke colleagues signed and contributed to this editorial, over 100 neuromuscular neurologists. It's really hard to get this many people in academic medicine to agree about anything. So this was a remarkable achievement, and it's something that continues to be referred to, in particular in the lay press. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. And this editorial had impact. We had significant coverage in the couple of months following it. This is a picture of one of my former patients, Fred Kellerman, who was on the front page of the New York Times. A couple of days later, there was a article, or rather a segment about this on Morning Edition, and Sabrina Tavernisi, who is the author of that. Sorry, just checking the chat to make sure that wasn't something new for me. The author of the New York Times article was on the News Hour, so a lot of coverage. And we were initially hopeful this might make a difference. For those of you who recall, early the next year, early in 2016, the FDA issued a refusal to file to Catalyst, and everyone thought, okay, maybe something good is going to happen. But ultimately, FIRDAPSE was approved. It was really inevitable because it was the first in the gate, but the price was absolutely gobsmacking at $375,000 a year, more than any of us would have anticipated. And this created a firestorm. Bernie Sanders got involved, as you can see on the left. And ultimately, the FDA did something that surprised me, not entirely. I actually had a different theory about what they might do to solve this, but instead what they did was to approve the Jacobus product for Lambert-Eaton in children. I don't see a lot of kids. In fact, I've never seen a kid with Lambert-Eaton. I bet Don has, but not a common problem. And this clearly was, what it seemed to be a workaround of sorts. I don't know, but ultimately the courts became involved when Catalyst filed a lawsuit. And just this last fall, an appeal of that lawsuit was denied. That Catalyst's suit was upheld, and the court would not rehear the case. And in fact, we had news just last week that Resurgi is no longer available. Interestingly, just a couple of days ago, Ed Silverman is a fantastic journalist who covers the pharmaceutical industry and has been writing Pharmalot for a long time and now works for STAT, which is a really great source of information. Wrote this article about patients that Dr. Sanders has been talking about who believe that FIRDAPSE does not work as well for them as the base formulation of 3,4-dimenopyridine. And in this article, that editorial was prominently featured and linked. And so the story continues. It's very disappointing. And so I'd like to use this as a motivating fact. For one, this would be a really significant problem and a very sombering outcome. But the story's not over yet, and this is why, frankly, we need all of you and to partner with our patients in advocating for a solution to some of this madness. Unfortunately, not at all unique. There are lots of examples of this, just a couple that'll be familiar to all of you, from the neurology space to tetrabenazine, which will come up again. $40 a month prior to the approval. We would, at the time, ship this in from the UK. Now $2,000 a month, probably more now. Nuedexta, cheap, quinidine, dextromethorphan, $600 a month, and there are multiple other examples of that. So, but is this really statistically meaningful, right? I mean, are these just the outliers? Well, here's data that suggests these sorts of approvals are actually not the outlier, they're the norm, not the exception. And so what this shows is different classes of approval. So the red down here are new molecular entity, first in class. This is what the Orphan Drug Act really intended to approve. And you can see when the Orphan Drug Act was approved, these actually represented much, if not most, of the approvals. But you can see now, new entity, first in class, or new entity, advanced in class, represent less than half of the orphan drug approvals. The rest, previously existing drugs approved for a new orphan purpose. Clearly not what Senators Waxman and Hatch had in mind, and Senator Waxman has spoken a fair bit about this, that the ODA is doing a great job, but there's some unintended consequences. This is the same kind of data. So you'll see new molecular entity. This is what we hope to see. And you can see historically a fair percentage of orphan drug indications related to new molecular entity, but you can see in 2017, only about a third were new molecular entities. The rest were secondary indications or evergreening, a new formulation. So pretty sobering data there. And this is cumulatively having a cost. I wrote this thing for HBR a few years ago and just did the simple math that if 10% of rare diseases had an effective treatment or an approved treatment at $150,000 a year, we'd be spending $21 trillion in the US on orphan drugs, and that'd be about 7% of the gross domestic product. I think a lot of people rolled their eyes at this and said, well, that's never going to happen. And I'll challenge you to think about that and look at the pace of drug development just in neuroscience space. It's nothing short of remarkable. And who would have thought that we would have 3 very effective FDA-approved drugs for SMA alone? Unbelievable. And just to put these GDP numbers into context, if you combine Virginia and North Carolina, I think we're pretty productive states. We would only account for about 2/3 of this cost. So it would be like all the work you and I are doing and add in another state, Georgia, go just to fund rare disease drugs. So I do think this is a significant issue for us, and it raises a lot of questions. One is the ethical concept of distributive justice, and another way of thinking about this is opportunity cost. So we can treat one SMA kiddo with nusinersen for the first year, $750,000. Very effective, very exciting drug, or we could spend $750 on 1,000 individuals. We don't have a framework for making that decision now, and ultimately this is a zero-sum game. And the term rationing is something that Americans really hate hearing, understandably, in reference to healthcare, but we ration right now. The problem is we ration in an implicit rather than explicit fashion. And so undoubtedly, our current form of implicit healthcare rationing, this isn't just for drugs and infusions, really for all of our healthcare, is putting our most vulnerable patients at risk. And so this is something we really need to think about as a society. And so there, in the drug price space, a couple of different ways of thinking about this. One is value. And of course, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to pivot from a volume-based to a value-based healthcare system. And value is defined as quality plus service over cost. Pretty simple concepts, hard to execute in reality. But when you go to most Americans, they don't want to know, is it valuable per se? They want to know, is it fair? And fair is a squishy concept, and fair does include quality. And here I just mean, does the drug work, right? Is it an effective drug? And what are the costs of that drug? If it costs a lot to make the drug company probably should be able to charge a higher dollar amount. What about innovation, or the term of externality? Patisiran, first RNAi therapy in humans, unbelievable advance. Should that command a higher price for a commensurate amount of quality and benefit just because it's innovative? And what about shareholders? I mean, we are a capitalist economy. What about shareholder return? And I would argue that fairness is an important concept, but in healthcare, we really need to be focusing on value. And I can give you an example to think a little bit about this. I've mentioned things, SMA treatment several times, and it's very hard to argue that these aren't immensely helpful and a game changer. Let's look at another rare disease drug, which is edaravone for ALS. This was approved now, 5 years ago. It's hard to believe. And these are the data, and Dr. Bedlak and others on your team can speak much more intelligently than I, but this is a fairly modest improvement in the ALS-FRS for a drug that cost $150,000 per year, which was actually priced a lot less than that in Japan before the approval. So you get an approval for a rare disease, increase modestly the number of people that are able to get the drug, which normally would mean in a free market economy, maybe the price drops a little bit. It goes up dramatically. And so from 7,000 to 150,000. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether this modest improvement in ALS-FRS is worth $150,000 per year, or whether we would be better off as a system, instead of using this, committing these dollars to treat more kids with Zolgensma, for instance. And so this is the challenge that we face as a health system. So in most parts of the world, most countries have a governmentally funded entity, a health technology assessment or HTA agency that's responsible for this. In the UK, it's NICE, which I'll talk about. We don't have that, but we do have ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. This is a picture of Steve Pearson, who's the president of ICER. And this is an organization I'll describe here in a moment. And I would say these days, not like 2018, ICER is no longer obscure. They are right at the center of the drug pricing narrative in the United States. And if you're interested, I can't mention Ted Burns without mentioning the Neurology podcast at least as many times as I mentioned his name. And so there are three podcasts, I know of at least three with Steve Pearson that are really informative. And the last one particularly interesting, as I'll get to in a moment. And so what does ICER do? Well, their goal, and then these are from Steve, I very much appreciate him sharing these slides with me. Their goal is sustainable access to high value care for all patients. And they do this by focusing on two things. One is what's the short-term affordability? This was a big issue with the hepatitis C drugs. Imagine if we had an effective Alzheimer's drug that cost $50,000 or $60,000 per year. I'm smiling a little bit for obvious reasons, but if that happened, what would this mean for society if we were going to treat all patients with Alzheimer's disease with a drug that costs $50,000 a year? There'd be a significant short-term affordability challenge we'd have to work our way through, even if it was a very valuable, effective treatment. But the bulk of what ICER does is focus on long-term value for money. And most of this is on cost effectiveness, although their models include contextual considerations and other variables. And the way it works is this: one really looks at the cost of a drug versus effectiveness. And effectiveness, there are a couple of different metrics, but the most commonly used one, imperfect as it is quality adjusted life years. Okay, so QALYs. And here we have a drug that is, pretty effective, it looks like, in terms of quality adjusted life years. And we see what the cost is compared to current existing standard of care, which is here. And what happens when a new drug comes in? Well, this new drug is a little more effective, a lot more expensive. And so the way really all HTA valuation exercises work is one creates a threshold, this cost effectiveness threshold. And I'll show you what their threshold is at ICER. It's very similar to what other countries do. And by creating this threshold, you can identify how far over it the drug is and determine, well, how much lower would the price need to be in order to meet that threshold. And so these reports, which are actually very interesting to read, all have tables like this. And this is from the amyloid neuropathy analysis for inotersen and patisiran. And you can see the list price here, or net price, so $345,000, $450,000. But the price to achieve a QALY per year of $100,000 or $150,000 per QALY is dramatically lower. And so the discount necessary to reach that threshold is very high. Now, when people see this, and sometimes when patients see this, and this certainly I think has been the case with the very exciting myasthenia approvals, folks kind of get uncomfortable and say, well, gosh, this drug, the fair price is higher than that. The fair price is higher than that. That may be true. The fair price might be higher than that, but is that the value-based price? The other thing I think that gets lost in some people's concerns about ICER is the fact that this is the beginning of a narrative, the beginning of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. And increasingly, pharmaceutical companies, including many I know and have worked with, go to ICER ahead of approval and have conversations with them. And that's always, I think, a fruitful exercise. And in fact, if you look at the approval of Zolgensma, this is something I asked Steve about in the most recent podcast I did with him. I suspect that the ultimate pricing decision made by the company was informed by their work with ICER. And so ICER is very, very involved. And the concept is it's something that is familiar to other countries. And so NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence in the UK, is responsible for value assessments in the UK, and they actually actively negotiate. And a great example is the most expensive drug on earth now, I think, is Livmeldy, which is for metachromatic leukodystrophy, another neurologic drug. This drug costs $3.8 million per year. So it makes Zolgensma look like a bargain. And initially, NICE refused to pay for it. But just released a few days ago was this news that they are going to pay for it. They negotiated a different price based on their analysis of its value. We don't know what that is, but it's the system working. And we'll talk more about governmental relief in the United States. But what we're seeing outside of governmental involvement is companies are starting to explore innovative pricing models. And this is just one example for a cancer drug that is using a warranty type concept. So if you get this lung cancer drug and it doesn't work, we'll pay your money back. And I think this is a bit of marketing, but there are other interesting models. There are states that are now using a subscription model for hepatitis C, for instance, not the disease, the drugs to treat it. And so there are a lot of proposed measures to relieve this, penalties for companies that raise prices beyond rate of inflation, capping out-of-pocket costs. This was a key component of the pharmaceutical pricing aspects of Build Back Better, international referencing, preventing evergreening and pay for delay, these sorts of strategies. And I feel like while we're not getting the relief we need, we're getting closer. There is also action in other branches of government, and this is some good news. It's nice to have some good news regarding a really interesting concept called skinny labeling. So yet another great term. So we've already talked about evergreening. So brand name drugs try to delay generic entry by obtaining additional patents that cover drugs formulation and method of use. And so the thing that's confusing here is that the intellectual property for drugs, it involves both patent law and exclusivity. And you can have different periods running for patents and exclusivity. So a method of use patent, which is the change in formulation or unique indication of the drug, those last 20 years. Now they're granted earlier in the process usually than a exclusivity period. But historically, generic manufacturers have been able to get approval for the generic as long as they exclude labeling for the patented use. So Humira has over 100 patents. And obviously here we're getting into biosimilar sort of approaches, but a generic version would move forward of a drug if it just steered clear of those method of use patents. So this is called skinny labeling, and it looked like this might go away last year. It's another article by Ed Silverman, whose name keeps coming up. And fortunately, we have recent good news that the courts have ruled that this is not going to go away, that skinny labeling doesn't actually infringe on patents. And so I always try and include something new in these talks because there's always really interesting things. And there's usually an interesting term like skinny labeling sitting behind it. Another concept that's now very much in the narrative is the role of NIH as stakeholder. So all drugs approved between 2010 and 2016 had NIH investment in preclinical, early clinical development. I don't know the data since that time, but I suspect it looks very similar. And there have been attempts to address this from a legislative perspective. Those of you who did Neurology on the Hill a couple of years ago will remember advocating for the We Paid Act, which was co-sponsored by Senators Van Hollen and Scott. You know, a Democrat from Maryland and a conservative Republican from Florida working together on this. And this would have required reasonable drug pricing strategies for drugs that the NIH had actually invested in and appropriately made, because we already paid for these drugs. Why would we pay again for these drugs? And this is increasingly in the narrative in the last several months. This hit the debate regarding costs for COVID drugs, which we see here. There's even now discussion about whether the Biden administration might actually take a swing at the so-called martian rights. This is for an innovative prostate cancer drug. The concept of this actually is codified in the Bayh-Dole Act that permits a government agency to do this. And there have been several proposals over the years to do it. I think NIH is reticent to wade into these waters, and the odds of this actually happening are quite low right now, but it's coming up more frequently, and it's an important concept and a potential lever that might be pulled from a regulatory perspective. So what can you do? What can I do? Well, we all have a voice in this. And the first is talk to your patients about financial toxicity and drug costs. If you prescribe a drug to your patient today in clinic, I'm in clinic. I'm going to leave here and I'll probably write a prescription with my resident fellow, and we're going to talk about the side effects of whatever we write. If it's an expensive drug, you need to find out whether your patient's going to even be able to fill it, which is hard because we don't know what the co-pays are, but at least have that conversation so that they can let you know, I can't afford this, so you can think about a different strategy. Provide resources, good RX. What can you do from appropriately using patient assistance programs, which I'm going to finish up talking about. Speak up when you can. The editorial that all of us participated in made a difference. It's still making a difference today. It may be the most impactful thing I've ever written, frankly. And so, which probably says a lot about other things I've written, but it is intrinsically incredibly valuable. Think about this in your collaborations. I would challenge my colleagues who participated in the Catalyst study for FIRDAPS. What were you doing? I mean, we knew these drugs worked. We've been using them for years. The drug trials, we learned a lot, and Don designed a really fantastic study, and we've learned a lot about how to assess Lambert-Eaton. But the reality is these trials were just to seek approval. Why would we encourage bad behavior? Hold our societies accountable. All of us have leadership roles in various organizations. keep them honest in their relationships with industry. I think the Academy, the American Academy of Neurology, does a very good job of this, but I think the reason they do a good job of it is member volunteers and staff leadership pay attention to it. And then I want to finish by this: don't buy into the whole expanded access, it's not going to cost your patient anything nonsense. This is the default. You're at a meeting and someone from a drug company comes up and says, hey, Gordon, what are you worried about? You know, your patient's going to get the drug. They're not going to pay anything. I think we all know we all pay for these sorts of things. And so the drug assistance programs come in several flavors: co-payment cards, manufacturer programs, and so forth. Keep in mind that some of these are not available to governmentally insured patients. But let's talk about charitable foundations. And this is a graphic from the Washington Post that describes this cycle, which is very kind of discouraging, and basically consists of drug companies donating money to patient assistance charities, usually rare disease charities, and that these charities then use the money for what they want to use, which often is giving the money to patients to afford, basically mitigate the financial toxicity of the drug. That money then flows back to the pharmacies who bought the drug from the drug company. And so it looks like a lot like money laundering to me. But you know, when it happens this way, it really is a kickback of sorts, really. And it became very common. So in 2015, almost $1.5 billion went into these sorts of charities, whereas 15 years earlier, it was only a couple of $1 million. Citigroup did an analysis a number of years ago that suggested for every dollar that went into these charities from a drug company perspective, they could recoup about $21 in incremental revenue. And this has certainly caught regulatory attention. And if you look out for this, you will see news about it every few weeks. Someone pays a fine. And so here are some recent ones for drugs that are in the rare disease space. And you'll see some that we've talked about earlier today. So Pfizer with, these are amyloid drugs for cardiomyopathy, Jazz, Lundbeck, Alexion was eculizumab, tetrabenazine involved in this. So this is something that people are paying attention to. I think the main point, though, is patient assistance programs. We should take advantage of them for our patients, but don't be tricked into thinking that this is the solution to the problem. And so I'm going to stop there. I see there's some chat questions, and so I'll take a look at that here in a second. But I do want to just emphasize the importance of Ted Burns in this. This is Ted, for those of you who know him, in typical repast in his office. A lot of these concepts come from Ted, and I talk to Ted frequently about these things, and I just want to acknowledge his leadership and his impact. So with that, I will pause and look at the chat, and hopefully there's some time for questions.
Dr. Smith, I can handle all the questions. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you very much. So Marvin, are you out there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
I just want to point out first, I've been told that pharmacy costs are more than all the other costs of maintaining the VA combined. Physician care, surgery, maintenance of property, taxes, everything else. Drug costs are more than all those combined. I also want to know if anybody's ever tried to figure out how much these members of the FDA that give or reject approval, how much are they getting sub rosa? Now, I know that can apply to all politicians, but I think that might be part of I think that's the reason that aducanumab was sort of approved in the last year. So anyway, those are just a couple of comments or questions.
Well, I guess I can comment on that briefly. I would say first, the VA, I don't know that statistic, but it wouldn't surprise me. But the VA actually has been out in front in our healthcare system and actually negotiating reasonable deals in drug pricing. I think the VA actually serves as a interesting model for that. And so I think we could, as is the case in a lot of healthcare, there are lessons to be learned from looking at the VA. I can't speak to, not going to get into, probably not appropriate to get into the sub rosa dealings of the FDA. I can tell you, having talked with former FDA staff to try to understand this process. Those with whom I've talked, kind of off the record, have been very committed in the work they do. And so I guess I'm an optimist. I choose to believe that most of the good folks at the FDA are trying to do the best job they can in a very difficult process. And the FDA, as far as drug pricing, doesn't have a role, and that's part of the problem. The fact that, to go back to the Catalyst Jacobus story, that Catalyst is approved and Jacobus was not, despite equal efficacy and a whole lot longer history of exposure. And if you think about it from a safety perspective, that's really important. Just because they got there, Don can probably tell us, weeks, months ahead of Jacobus is just crazy, right? So I think that there may be, inappropriate things happening at an individual level, but I think that this is a system problem. And the VA is, just to bring it back to a positive note, perhaps offer some system solutions for us.
Don?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how long, how much time there was between the Catalyst approval of Threefour DAP and the Jacobus approval, but it wasn't more than a couple of months, so it was very tight. And as you say and emphasize, I think the FDA cannot consider cost in their decision making, and I guess that's a good thing in many regards, but limiting in others. I do want to comment on one of the points you made in your suggestions as to what we can do, and that is to consider your collaborations. One of the most discouraging things to me about our regulatory study of the Jacobus drug was that investigators who had been receiving Jacobus drug for free for their patients for years signed up for the Catalyst study. And my reaction to that was, I don't know how I would feel if one of my patients realized that I had used their data to help develop an approval for a drug that now costs more than they could afford.
Yeah, I've actually thought a lot about that, Don, and I think there's an awful lot to unpack, and it's well worth us unpacking it because it has much broader implications for what drives us, particularly in academic medicine. And, I've done a lot of clinical trials in my career, and in my last job, now I just deal with people complaining to me, but in my last job, I, ran a complicated clinical trial portfolio, and we would seek industry studies that were of interest, that our patients would be interested in, that we can make a margin on, because we use that margin to backfill underfunded NIH clinical trials and lean times, right? And so I would like to think we would not, no matter what the margin looked like, have participated in the Catalyst trial. I know we wouldn't have, because I know the space so well and I'm so dedicated to it. But when I look at the people who are investigators, there are a lot of good people who did that. And it tells me that there's something in our incentives, or at least our situational awareness of these issues, that's missing, which is why I think it's so, I think it's great that you asked that question, because it's one thing to say it in a grand rounds, it's another thing listening to it, to consider it the next time you're looking at a potentially margin generating clinical trial to balance out your portfolio. I think this is, in some ways, it's like DEI. If it's not in the front of your mind and you're not thinking about it, focusing on it, and recognizing the system impact and the individual impact, then we're not going to make progress. So that's a really important question.
Well, one thing that I thought of that one could do is, when you're signing up for a drug, or if you're involved in developing a protocol for a drug study, is to ask the sponsor what their pricing policy will be. You won't get much of an answer up front, but if everybody said that, if all of the investigators, potential investigators, said, we want to have a definite statement on what your pricing policy is going to be, I'll bet you'd get some, well, maybe you'd get some.
You get vague answers. I think Catalyst made the mistake of telling us what their pricing policy was going to be. But
All right, we'll have one last question. Kevin Van Landingham, why don't you?
Yeah, Gordon, thanks. And Don, thanks for all the work you've done. As somebody that's been on the fence from each of these sides, I can tell you right now, FDA is run by laws. If you want to change any of what FDA does, you need the government to change it. As far as pricing, Gordon, you quote a lot of fixed markets. Canada's the same way, Europe is the same way. If you want to get away from free market economy, you have to pass laws. FDA, Marvin, I've never been in a more draconian system. I have had to divest all of my stocks, and not only the pharmaceutical industry, which I can understand, but also food products. So while you hear congressmen talking about, oh, we've got to change this investment stuff, they pass laws for government employees that they don't have to abide by. And all these congressmen are just wheeling and dealing on information that they've got, and they're not punished. So as individuals, I agree, Don, you've got to push the companies, because what Catalyst did most likely is they paid all the physicians fees to keep them in line. And unless we as physicians stand up and say, that's not right, that we have to fix that. They're not going to fix it because they've got a great system. And then the last piece about, I lost my train of thought. Timing. You know, Don, it could be one day. If FDA accepts a submission, they are on a fixed clock, and God can't change that, because all that's etched in stone, it's etched in law, and they have to meet those timelines. So this is not a fault with FDA. They're not getting paid under the table. They can't own these stocks, so they're not making any money off of them. So there's all this talk about, it's like conspiracies. It really drives me nuts to see what's going on. And you know, everybody's pointing fingers. The problem is we've got to get our government to be responsive, because it's going to bankrupt. You can't, this is a Ponzi scheme if I've ever seen one. Everybody's getting their hands in the pies. Thanks, Rich.
So I agree. I think the answer has to be a legislative and regulatory answer. It's not individuals at the FDA. I totally agree with everything you said. And I think we all have a voice in that. Physicians should be at the front line and advocating for this.
But here's one final comment that'll make you think. When the price of Threefour DAP increased in the UK, their health service said, sorry, we're not going to pay for it. So every patient in the UK who had previously been receiving this drug at a reasonable cost found themselves with no support for it. And they had to stop taking it. Think about what would happen in this country if that were a policy.
And whenever something like that happens, Don, the lawyers are there for the drug companies because they got plenty of money, and they're going to take it to court. And I can guarantee they're going to win that case the way the laws are currently written. So, well,
I'll quote my favorite author who said, first, get rid of all the lawyers.
That's in the
That was
Bible.
marvelous, Gordon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great Grand Ryan's. Thanks.
Yeah. Janice Massey sends her regards on the chat box too.
Janice, thank you so much. It's always great to see you. I look forward. I hope I can come visit you guys in person. I haven't been to Duke in forever, so I'd love a rain check to come down and
if I can put in a plug, I was at in Richmond this weekend. It's actually a beautiful city.
It is. You should have called.
Enjoyed it. All right, everyone, stay safe. Bye-bye. Thank you, Dr.
Bye.
Smith and Don, for setting this up. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.